of us were really excited to have a friend that lived right next door.
It looked like the perfect place to grow up.
We weren't up to mischief. We were practicing a sport and hanging out in front of the parents.
But what's music to some ears is noise to others.
Stay away from my yard.
He was getting so angry at the kids.
Get off the driveway. Go on.
It's not a crime as a child to play outside.
One way or another, order will be restored.
It's all too common of an American story.
My yard!
Even if blood is spilled to achieve it.
An argument that escalates to the use of deadly force.
Hey, it's an accident.
You're just in shock.
If you've ever visited Washington, D.C., you probably passed through Leesburg, Virginia to get there.
It was just a two-stoplight town back then. It was a very, very safe place to live.
In our quaint little neighborhood, a lot of us have good jobs with the federal government.
These were nicely manicured, relatively newly built homes on a quiet cul-de-sac. It was the American dream for a lot of people.
Bob Lorenz and his wife Laura have lived here for about 15 years.
Do you want me to pick anything up on the way home?
If you could...
After retiring as a non-commissioned officer from the U.S. military, Bob joined Homeland Security. It's a high-pressure job. He needs peace and relaxation when he comes home.
They were very nice people, very quiet. They were very friendly. He kept an immaculate yard.
I remember going and sitting on their front porch and talking to them when I was younger. I remember him and his wife being nice. I mean, they were just another neighbor that was in a good neighborhood.
For Betty Comerford, there's just one small issue with life on this otherwise great street. The house next door.
The house was a rental property, so we had quite a few neighbors to come and go. You constantly have people move in and out, and sometimes they're good people and sometimes they're not.
One spring, the home welcomes a family of 3.
So are you excited?
It's another set of renters, and they're a bit different compared to everyone else in this buttoned-up neighborhood.
Come on, cheer up.
Oh, it's not so bad. Come on.
Duran and Peggy Eldridge have made the move to Leesburg from California with their 12-year-old daughter, Leah.
Wait, friends. I'm not good at making friends.
My mom's family was all back east, so we moved out to Virginia, which I was very upset about. I did not want to move to Virginia. I didn't want to leave California. I was a beach kid, so moving to Virginia and, like, you know, shopping for winter coats and being in the snow, it wasn't the greatest thing to me.
Who could imagine that settling in this lovely community would down the road result in terrible violence?
Get off my yard. There was never any trouble until you and that kid of yours moved into our... Come back here.
For now, the move to Virginia feels right for Leah's parents.
What about these ones?
No way! That's a myth.
Despite Leah's disappointment, this trio is a tight little clan. Duran, a truck driver, has really stepped up for both mother and daughter.
Don't show me your car.
My mom and my dad split when I was really young.
4 6s.
Duran was my stepfather, and they got together when I was about 7 years old. He was my dad, you know, he took care of me, he taught me everything.
I don't know what to do.
How to be tough, how to deal with boys, how to, you know, how to scuba dive, how to ski, how to ride an ATV.
Father!
We always found the funny in things.
Hi, I'm Betty.
Betty takes to these newcomers immediately.
Duran Eldridge and his wife Peggy and their daughter Leah were very nice neighbors. Duran was very friendly. He was just a very, very social guy. He would keep the shirt off his back. He was so nice. If you needed anything, if you were in trouble, he would help you.
It's a great neighborhood. Look at it.
Yeah.
Bob lives right across the street from the new neighbors. Unfortunately, things start off on the wrong foot.
Just get along really well.
Our Doberman had run across the street and peed on his lawn.
Hey, go on, get out of here. Go on.
Come on. Get. Go home.
Is that your dog?
Yeah, sorry about that. She's usually on a leash.
We kind of shook it off, like, you know, apologized. Oh, sorry, you know, grab the dog.
Yeah, you gotta keep it on the leash.
We have a leash. I'll keep her on leash.
Certainly couldn't have been the way that family wanted to make their first impression in the neighborhood.
From now on, she didn't get anything too bad, did she?
Peed on the flowers.
That happens often in neighborhoods where they're very established and everybody owns their own home.
That story that happened won't happen again.
Let's hope not.
Okay.
I don't think that Mr. Lorenz was really happy with the house being a rental. He was a very by-the-book kind of guy.
My mom was the type of person who would like wave at people, you know, coming up the street or whatever and pull into her driveway. They just were never really friendly. They were the type like you would wave and they wouldn't wave back at you, you know what I mean? So we kind of like got the hint quick and we just kept to ourselves.
The new arrivals may have made a bad impression on Bob Lorenz, but the friendship with the neighbors next door continues to grow.
Leah and I became friends right away. I loved Duran and loved Peggy.
Both of us were really excited to have a friend that lived right next door. So it's almost like we lived together.
We were into the same things. We were into the same music.
A long, happy summer gives way to a new school year. New friends are welcome to drop by after class and on weekends.
Sometimes it would be up to 15 and 20 kids after school would come to our street. Our street was kind of a hangout place. And everybody would migrate to our neighborhood.
And no one is happier than Duran.
I think my dad really wanted to keep an eye on what I was up to and what me and my friends really were doing. And so he invited them to just come to the house. He's like, okay, you want to hang out with your friends? Have them all come here.
I'd spent a lot of time over at their house.
I think I hurt you more than I hurt myself.
They were extended family.
God, I'm so bored. Entertain me.
He was a good time guy.
I think you hurt them. Yeah.
Duran was fun, you know? Everybody loved him.
Well, not everybody. And especially not someone who loves peace and quiet as much as Bob Lorenz.
I do remember him opening his door and staring at us. And that was a clear indication that he was not pleased with whatever we were doing. We all kind of thought he was a jerk.
I don't know.
I just thought he was like a grumpy old man that lived across the street. You know, I was a child and he wasn't that nice. We'd be outside playing and you could tell that someone was behind a curtain watching us. Like the curtain would shift and they'd be looking at us out a window. So like as kids, it was kind of a joke.
But this was no laughing matter to the military man.
Way to go!
The rules are being broken. and battle lines are being drawn.
Get off the driveway! Go on! Hey, Durin!
It snowballed fast, you know, and then all hell broke loose.
Two neighbors. Two very different types of men. Bob Lorenz is ex-military, follows the rules, expects everyone else to do the same.
Where did you get these tulips? They're lovely.
I know, aren't they fantastic? I thought they were such
On his property, there's nothing out of place.
I loved how their house looked. It always was very neat. Everything was tidy.
That's the way a lot of his neighbors like it.
This was a nice middle-class neighborhood. Nothing ever happened out of the ordinary here.
Okay. Start with this. This one is no.
Durin Eldridge, a truck driver, is younger, messier, looser.
This is why you shouldn't ever have boys over. Ever. No boys over.
He, his wife Peggy, and daughter Leah recently made a big move here from California.
I was used to the culture of California. You know, it's very open and it's very freed up, and, you know, we have pretty chill communities, and Virginia was very rednecky and right-wing.
That's just one opinion, of course. Like most of us, Bob Lorenz always does his duty making sure the neighborhood is as orderly as his front lawn. But now, across the street, things are getting out of hand.
Where are we gonna go? We have no money. We have skateboards. You know, we're just little rugrat kids. You know what I mean? Skateboarding around and hanging out.
And Durin loves having everyone over.
Durin Eldridge was one of the kids. I called him the Pied Piper because the kids were over at his house daily. They were over there all the time.
I thought it was great. I mean, he really felt like, you know, he was like a father to all of us. He brought us all in. Nobody was ever excluded. The kind of father I wish, you know, I had in my life at the time. He's a good guy.
Bob Lorenz doesn't agree. He has a demanding job at Homeland Security, and it's hard for him to relax with all the noise.
First time he yelled at one of us, I believe somebody had fallen off their skateboard and had gone up into his driveway and into his flower garden.
Get off the driveway! Go on!
He'd come out and he started yelling very loudly. He didn't particularly get in anybody's face, but he definitely made it known to each and every person there that we weren't welcome.
The California recent arrivals didn't understand the East Coast property borderlines. Eldridge, primarily through his kids, was willing to ignore that property line and was willing to trespass on it.
Even when there isn't a street party at the renter's house, other things happen that drive the two neighbors further and further apart.
Durin had not put the handbrake on, and so the car rolled out of the driveway. It rolled across the street and hit Mr. Lorenz's car.
Hey! Hey, Durin!
That was an unfortunate thing that happened.
It's not bad, though. Sorry about that, man. That was my mistake. I didn't pull the emergency brake.
How can you let your car roll down and cross the street into my driveway?
It was very minor damage, if any.
Look, not even a scratch, man.
You know, that's not even the point. You gotta show a little respect.
He was extremely livid for that, and I'm sure that gave him another oomph in his brain on why he hated us so very much.
We good?
These kids are all over my yard. They're dogs.
Some of us think Bob is totally justified in getting angry.
I need a car sent.
Though we also have to wonder if this is really a clash between blue collar and white collar.
Afternoon, officer.
I think it was clear to some on that block that they perhaps were not there to put down the same sort of deep roots as others. Might have been a little sort of looking down upon them.
Lorenz worked for the government, and my dad was very, you know, athletic, and he drove trucks.
You gotta be kidding me. Are you serious?
So in the way that society looks at us or judges us by our profession, it's a truck driver and a government employee. It wasn't like, you know, we got a car on blocks out front and a refrigerator on the porch, and my dad's drunk on the porch drinking a beer. But this guy across the street is like, these people and their whole existence is an eyesore.
Okay. So you're more than welcome.
Curiously, not all noise is treated equally.
A neighbor 2 doors down set up a basketball stand. Their son used it on a regular basis, and nobody complained. And maybe it has something to do with they didn't own the property, they just rented it, and everybody else owned it.
It's almost like the fates are drawing the two men ever closer to tragic confrontation.
Get off my yard! Bob!
At that age, the world was still innocent. I couldn't have imagined that things would have gotten to where they did get.
What is that?
Dad, stop! No!
This was a sort of place where the police were more likely to be writing speeding tickets or dealing with minor infractions, like the odd drunk guy walking in the street or a small petty burglary. Shootings, homicides were highly unusual.
In the small, affluent town of Leesburg, Virginia,
Are you talking about yourself?
Now what?
Bob Lorenz is feeling under siege.
Go away!
A few months back, his neighbor's dog urinated on his lawn.
Go on, get out of here.
His car was dented in an act of carelessness.
Hey, Darren!
He liked living in a nice, quiet neighborhood with no kids, probably. I never saw a bad side of him. They seemed like a very a happy couple and everything normal, but I guess he just had a part of him that was easily triggered.
What are they doing?
Don't worry, honey, it'll be okay.
I'm sick and tired of this.
On the other hand, Duran Aldridge couldn't be happier that his daughter Leah and her friends used their place as a gathering spot.
We weren't up to mischief, doing anything wrong. You know, we were practicing a sport and hanging out there in front of the parents for everybody to see, nothing to hide.
Bob isn't the only one who's irritated by the kids and their noise. We didn't say anything, but Bob did. constantly.
Stay away from my yard. Keep that racket down.
I was disappointed that he was getting so angry at the kids. I think he was being a little overzealous. They were good kids. He wanted those skateboards gone.
We tried to apologize for what we did. We weren't punk kids. We were respectful of our elders. He didn't want to hear our apologies. He made it known that just to leave, to stop skateboarding.
This is a close-knit town. As a security specialist for the government, Bob knows a lot of people.
It's like they...
And he uses those connections to crack down on the disturbances.
He knew everybody in this whole area. I think he had friends in the police.
Yes, it's Bob.
So if he called them with a concern, they would do him a favor.
I need a car sent out.
The last time I checked in the United States, it's not a crime as a child to play outside.
Hello, officer.
Duran and Peggy were very upset when Bob would call the police on the kids.
I can't believe this guy.
Neither one of them did not understand why. He didn't like kids.
You know, they're just kids. They're just
When
having fun.
Mr. Lorenz called the police on the skateboarding kids, that was a particular point of tension.
Anyway, thank you.
Then word traveled around among the children, the parents and neighbors.
And it doesn't take long for the next attack. An anonymous letter is circulated through the neighborhood, warning everyone that the whole area is going to pieces, thanks to all the young skateboarders.
It's had something to do with drive-by shootings and drugs in the neighborhood, and I didn't know of any drugs in the neighborhood, and we weren't having drive-by shootings, and it was just kind of a crazy letter.
This is interesting. You look concerned.
I am.
We kind of guessed it would sound like something Bob would send.
This is coming from the guy next door. I know it. It's
because he could be a little dramatic about things.
Who else got this? You got it? Did anyone else get it?
I think the whole neighborhood got it.
Yeah,
I don't know why he would even write such a letter. That was just a very bizarre thing.
Then, things escalate even further. When, early one morning in the neighborhood, chilling screams ring out from the Eldridge home.
Dad, stop! No! Stop! Dad, stop! Stop! No!
Authorities are summoned.
Come on in.
The police showed up. They were like, "Can you talk to us?" And I'm like, "Sure." They're like, "Are you being hit? Are you being abused?" And I was like, "I don't understand." And they're like, that's why we're here. We were called because your neighbor thinks that you're being beaten.
It's a very serious accusation. But sound can be deceiving.
Dad had come home and our dog had gone to the bathroom on the floor. And so my dad had spanked the dog.
Come here.
Stop
Bad
yelling
dog.
at
Leah.
the dog!
It's a bad dog.
Stop!
I'm yelling at my dad, "Don't spank the dog."
It's bad.
Stop!
Leah.
Stop yelling at the dog!
The dog is going outside. Come on. I would never touch my kids. I would never touch my wife. Okay, the dog pissed me off.
And then they went and confirmed it with him.
Stressful week, but I didn't lay a hand on him.
It was like clearly a miscommunication, while they were there.
A wife beater or a child beater?
Having the police told that you've assaulted your daughter is crossing the line. And Duran is pretty sure he knows who called them.
Yes, yeah, this is Bob Lorenz.
He was really upset. My dad definitely was offended by that. He was offended that people would think that he would beat on his child, saying that I'm being hit or that I'm in the living room crying and screaming, and it was a lot.
If it was Bob, was he acting out of spite? Or did he genuinely think he was helping a girl in distress?
Stop! No!
There's no way to know. But the incident poisons the atmosphere even further.
You just feel like you're being watched, basically. This person is watching us, which was weird. It's creepy, you know? It's creepy.
Everything was on public display. The cops are coming up, and, you know, that puts anybody on edge, you know, when you see cops in your neighborhood all the time. I definitely felt a change in the neighborhood. All the neighbors seemed more closed off. There was tension.
It's cheesy. It's not cheesy. It's so bad.
Everyone hoped the strain would dissipate. But there's no chance of that.
Just sounds like that.
Instead of finding a way to diffuse that tension,
We're here to stay.
they saw the worst in the other, and it just made each angrier.
My yard! Bob! Come back here!
For exclusive footage, go to investigationdiscovery.com.
Here we go. Come on, give me some.
Get up the yard!
There was so much turmoil in the neighborhood, and we just didn't understand what had happened. It was very emotional, and it kept me emotional for a long time.
This is no longer the peaceful neighborhood we were proud to call home.
Tell your friends to go somewhere else.
One night, just within eyesight of Bob's lawn, someone writes an obscenity with fire. We never find out who did this. Some neighbors point the finger at Duran.
My dad had a funny sense of humor, but he wasn't like a midnight vandal. That sounded like something that kids in my age range, some 13-year-old, 14, 15, 16-year-old kid would have done. Not a grown man who has to get up and go to work tomorrow morning. But things like that just automatically got pointed at us.
Nothing is proved. Nothing is resolved. And just a few weeks later, this street battle reaches the point of no return.
This was a month before my 14th birthday. And it was a Sunday afternoon, and I had school off for the whole following week because it was spring break. We were right in front of the house, just skateboarding and doing tricks. We've done it 100 times before. We were just having fun.
At 6 o'clock on a Sunday evening, Duran has been kicking back, drinking a few beers. Some would later say he was drunk. Others say that's ridiculous. Like so often, the former soldier is keeping watch over the enemy.
I'm standing in the window, and he was probably getting more and more upset, just, you know, building rage inside.
David's skateboard flew into his yard. Because David was always like trying to do these like monster tricks and always just messing them up.
Get off my yard! Go on!
Bob came out and started yelling at us again.
How many times do I gotta tell you kids to stay off my yard?
He was like, you need to get your board off my lawn. You can't be out here. You know, he just went in, like verbally. Like he's out here, he's yelling at these kids.
Off the yard.
Bob, got a problem?
My dad could hear him because he was right there at the garage. And I think it reached that boiling point where it was like, all right, like now's the time to have the conversation with this guy.
If you got a problem with the kids, talk to me, okay? Don't yell at the kids. Come talk to me.
We never had any of this problem until you, your wife, your kid, and your dog moved into
If you're a grown man and you're an adult, come talk to me, who's a grown man and an adult, and I can deal with them. You know, don't take it upon yourself to parent other people's kids, or not even parent them, like literally berate them, verbally assault them.
They'll stay off your yard.
You know, we were fine up until your type moved in.
What's my type, Bob?
You rent. You're not sticking around. You're gonna be out of here in 3 months.
They got into a verbal altercation. They're yelling at each other back and forth. They're flinging insults back and forth. You know, both of them are guilty of talking poorly to each other.
Your daughter's one of the worst ones.
Believe my daughter.
They don't care. You don't care. That little kid of yours doesn't care.
Listen, man, what is...
Both of them should have communicated better. You know, they both were angry. It had been building up.
Wife, the dog, the kid.
The buildup was never addressed. And so it just exploded into a full-on verbal altercation.
My yard!
Listen, man, they're having a good time, okay? What is your problem? Listen, don't walk away. Get back here, we're gonna talk about this. What, you can yell at some kids, but you can't come talk to me? We're gonna get out here.
Lorenz had gone back in his house now, was still like talking out the door. And my dad said, all right, well, come outside then.
Okay, we got something to fix. Such a tough guy, hey? You can yell at a bunch of kids, but you can't stay out and talk to me? You call yourself a man? Let's get out here.
You wanna talk, like, what's up? You're a man, I'm a man, like, you wanna throw hands then? He's basically saying, so what is this then? You wanna fight then?
Like a crazy person.
Get out of my face!
I'm not in your face!
And I started yelling again, and it escalated.
You're acting like a psycho. Okay?
Never had trouble until you guys moved into the neighborhood.
Well, we live here now.
You don't come in this door.
Fine.
Dern kept repeating, you know, he obviously wanted to fight Bob and kept telling him to come out of the house and go into the street, and they would fight it out.
Okay?
My problem's not with the kids, it's with you.
Oh, come.
If only it had stopped there. What a terrible, tragic difference the next few seconds will make.
Your life is normal and you're a child, and then an hour later, the life that you knew, it doesn't exist anymore.
Get out of my face!
We live here now.
What you thought your life was completely dissipates into thin air.
You need to have a car sent out here immediately.
Bob and Duran have lived across the street from each other for 1 year. One year of escalating hostility that leads up to this terrible confrontation.
We're gonna get out here.
Couldn't believe that it was happening. Like, Dern was walking in front. I've never really seen anybody, you know, confront somebody like that. You know, go into somebody else's yard up to their door. I was kind of amazed. You know, felt good they was sticking up for us.
My problem's not with the kids, it's with you.
Oh, come.
At some point in this heated exchange, Bob Lorenz grabs a loaded .380 caliber semi-automatic pistol.
What exactly transpires in those last moments was the subject of some dispute.
Lorenz said that Eldridge stepped up into the door and opened the screen door. Eldridge was standing in his front door, and he threatened to shoot him. And he said, "Don't come in the door.
We live here now.
You don't come in this door.
And then, in between the shouts of anger, a short, sharp sound.
All I heard was pretty much a pop, and it sounded like a cap gun. I really wasn't sure what the sound was. Thought maybe he fired a blank at him, kind of scare him.
Just like that. And so then it's just hell, you know? Then it's just complete hell. He turned around, he walked across the street, he was throwing up blood everywhere.
And I was standing in the middle of the street, and he walked up to me. Said I think he had been shot, and he started spitting up blood. And so I walked with him over to his yard. He ended up collapsing on the hood of his car, and just blood just all over the place.
Come on.
I sat Duran down on the ground and ended up starting to have to do CPR on him.
Somebody help! Call 911! Mom!
My mom comes running outside. You know, she's in the house making dinner on a normal Sunday night. She comes running outside into hell.
Help! Somebody help us!
He couldn't breathe, you know? He was literally drowning in his own blood. He was suffocating.
I continued, giving Duran breaths, and he actually still had a pulse all the way up until when the paramedics arrived.
I love you.
The ambulance came and got him, and we were all hoping that he wasn't dead, that they could revive him or save him.
We went and saw Leah and went to her house, and we all sat and cried.
My mom went to the hospital. David's mom came over to the house and stayed with the kids. My mom was gone for hours.
No.
When she came back, I just knew by her face. She looked different forever after that point. She never looked the same as she did that day, and I don't think any of us did.
Duran Eldridge was 31 years old. Bob Lorenz is arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He posts bail and is free to go while he awaits trial. For family and friends, Duran's death is made even harder by having to live across the street from his killer.
It was uncomfortable. Duran died, and he's still there living his life in plain view.
Finally, Bob's court date arrives. The button-down government employee versus the truck driver.
It all really came down to, what did the jury there think? Was Bob Lorenz justified in using deadly force against Duran Eldridge?
Get out here! Get out! You call yourself a man?
Was he right to feel, as he claimed, that his life was in danger? Or was this one angry neighbor deciding he was going to end it once and for all through the barrel of a gun?
Duran's loved ones expect justice in what to them was clearly a cold-blooded homicide. But Bob Lorenz is found not guilty. His lawyers are able to convince the jury he had acted in self-defense.
I was stunned. I had expected, if anything, Lorenz to have been convicted on a lesser charge. Didn't expect him to be fully acquitted.
Never had trouble until you guys moved into the neighborhood.
Well, we live here now.
You don't come in this door.
Fine. I teach.
Bob Lorenz said, don't come in the house. And if that's what happened, and I couldn't prove it didn't, then it was a justified shooting. And therefore, he was acquitted. And it was a fair jury. It's a fair verdict, and that's the way it goes.
Months after Duran's death, the family moves out of Leesburg. Bob Lorenz and his wife remain on the street for another 13 years.
We put bows up on the mailboxes every April 9th in remembrance.
Bob Lorenz really got upset at that, and I don't know if he removed them. I know he complained about them.
1 year after moving away, Leah returns to our street to see the house where her father was shot.
And I sat on the lawn, you know, my old house. And I wasn't making noise, or I just came to revisit where I had been living. And the police showed up. Just my presence alone, just being outside, was enough to have the police called. I can't really comprehend the people who live within like so much fear and hatred.
A big part of all of us died that day. So how's my family? Well, my family's kind of like part dead and part alive. All of us. You know? It's inexplicable. How's my family? My family's sad. That's how my family is.
Can't bring it back again, can't bring them back, my friend. I got tears that bend out the corners of my eyes, in the corner where I cry.
Duran's daughter is pursuing a career in music under the name of Princess Leah.
The road outside the small Illinois town was almost empty that night, the kind of quiet stretch of asphalt where headlights feel like the only living thing for miles. It was January 2003, a winter so sharp the air itself seemed to crack when the wind moved across the frozen fields. At 2:17 in the morning, a passing driver noticed something strange along the shoulder of County Road 14. At first it looked like a pile of dark clothing pushed against the snowbank. But as the headlights swept across it again, the driver slowed. The shape didn't move. It didn't belong there. Within minutes, the silence of that road was broken by flashing red and blue lights. A patrol cruiser idled beside the ditch, its engine humming in the cold. Deputies stepped carefully through the snow, their boots crunching across frozen gravel. And there, half hidden beneath a thin crust of windblown ice, lay the body of a young woman. She had no coat. The temperature that night hovered just above 10 degrees. Frost had already begun to form along her hair. One of the deputies would later say the scene felt wrong in a way that was hard to explain. Not chaotic. Not violent in the obvious sense. Just wrong. Like something had been placed there and abandoned in a hurry. Her name, investigators would soon learn, was Emily Carter, 23 years old. A waitress at a diner just off the interstate. A familiar face to almost everyone in town. The kind of person people described the same way over and over again, quiet, polite, always smiling when she took your coffee order. By sunrise, word had already begun spreading across the town like a cold wind. A young woman found dead on the roadside. No witnesses. No obvious explanation. And before the day ended, detectives would quietly start using two words that every community fears hearing: cold case. But in January 2003, nobody believed that yet. Because at the beginning, every investigation feels solvable. Every mystery seems like it only needs one more interview, one more piece of evidence, one more overlooked detail waiting to be uncovered. The sheriff's department moved quickly. Yellow tape sealed off the roadside ditch while crime scene technicians worked under portable floodlights. Cameras flashed against the darkness. Every footprint in the snow was photographed, measured, preserved. The first discovery came quickly. Emily Carter had not died on that road. The medical examiner confirmed it less than 24 hours later. There were no signs of a struggle in the snowbank, no blood spatter, no broken branches nearby. Whoever left her there had done it carefully, quietly, sometime during the night. The road itself had seen almost no traffic. Which meant one thing. Someone had driven there. And someone had carried her out of a vehicle. Inside the sheriff's office, detectives began piecing together Emily's last known hours. She had worked the late shift at the diner, clocking out shortly after midnight. Several co-workers remembered seeing her gather her purse and jacket. One waitress recalled a brief conversation near the door. Emily had mentioned meeting someone later. She hadn't said who. That detail would haunt investigators for years. Because whoever she planned to meet that night was the last person who may have seen her alive. The diner's parking lot camera offered a blurry glimpse of her leaving. The timestamp read 12:38 a.m. Emily walked across the dimly lit asphalt, climbed into her small silver sedan, and drove out toward the highway. That was the final confirmed sighting. After that, the timeline collapsed into silence. Detectives searched her apartment the next morning. Nothing appeared out of place. Her bed was neatly made. Her closet still held the winter coat she had not been wearing when her body was found. Her phone, an older flip model common at the time, sat on the kitchen counter, battery nearly dead. She had left it behind. In 2003, that detail mattered less than it would today. People sometimes forgot their phones. But investigators noticed something else immediately. Emily Carter was known to carry that phone everywhere. Friends described it as practically glued to her hand. Leaving it behind meant something had interrupted her routine. Or someone had. The autopsy deepened the mystery. There were no defensive wounds. No signs she had fought back. The cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma to the head, delivered by a single powerful blow. The medical examiner noted something chilling in the report. The injury suggested the attack had come suddenly, possibly from someone standing very close to her. Someone she didn't perceive as a threat. In a small town, that implication spreads like wildfire. Within days, rumors began circulating across coffee shops, gas stations, and church parking lots. People started looking at neighbors differently. Parents warned their children not to walk alone at night. The diner where Emily worked became strangely quiet, customers speaking in low voices whenever her name came up. The sheriff's department followed every lead they could find. Emily's co-workers were questioned repeatedly. Her friends, her neighbors, former classmates, even customers who had been inside the diner that night. Phone records were examined. Bank transactions reviewed. Every person who had crossed her path during the final week of her life became part of the investigation. And yet nothing definitive emerged. No witness had seen her meet anyone after leaving work. No surveillance cameras along the highway captured her car. The stretch of rural road where her body was found remained frustratingly isolated. Then, 4 days after the discovery, detectives found the car. It sat abandoned behind a closed hardware store nearly 8 miles from where Emily had been left in the ditch. The silver sedan looked untouched at first glance. Doors locked. Windows intact. A thin sheet of snow covering the hood. But inside the vehicle, investigators noticed something that made the entire room go silent. The driver's seat was pushed unusually far back. Emily Carter stood barely 5'3". She never drove with the seat that far from the steering wheel. Someone taller had been behind that wheel. Crime scene technicians combed through the car for hours. Fibers were collected. Fingerprints dusted from the dashboard and door handles. A faint smear appeared along the passenger side interior panel, something dark that might once have been blood. The lab results would take weeks. Meanwhile, the investigation continued spreading outward, touching more lives with every passing day. Detectives learned that Emily had recently ended a brief relationship with a man from a neighboring town. They tracked him down, questioned him for nearly 6 hours. His alibi held. Another tip pointed toward a customer who had reportedly flirted with her frequently at the diner. He too was interviewed, his background checked. Nothing linked him to the crime. Weeks turned into months. The case grew colder. By the end of 2003, the evidence boxes had already begun filling an entire shelf in the sheriff's storage room. Photographs, interview transcripts, lab reports, maps of the town marked with colored pins. Every detective who worked the case believed the answer was somewhere inside those files. They just couldn't see it yet. Years drifted past. The diner replaced Emily's photo on the employee wall with someone new. Her family moved away from the town that now carried too many memories. The roadside ditch along County Road 14 returned to its usual emptiness, traffic passing without anyone remembering the night flashing lights had filled the darkness. But inside the sheriff's office, the label on the evidence boxes changed quietly. Cold case. For nearly 2 decades, the mystery remained frozen there untouched, unresolved, lingering like a shadow over the town. New detectives joined the department and heard the story from older officers who had worked the scene that night. They all said the same thing. Something about the case never felt finished. And then, 20 years later, technology changed everything. In 2023, a forensic lab in Chicago contacted the sheriff's department with a proposal. Advances in trace DNA analysis now allowed investigators to extract genetic material from evidence once considered useless. Samples too small to test in 2003 could now reveal entire profiles. Boxes that had gathered dust for decades suddenly mattered again. When technicians reopened the evidence from Emily Carter's car, they focused on the faint smear along the passenger door panel, the one technicians had photographed but never fully identified. The sample had been too degraded for testing back then. Now it wasn't. Weeks later, the results arrived in a sealed envelope. Inside the sheriff's office, detectives gathered around a desk as the lab report was opened. No one spoke for several seconds. Because the DNA profile extracted from that old smear didn't belong to Emily Carter. It belonged to someone else. Someone whose name already existed quietly inside the original investigation files. A man who had spoken to detectives back in 2003. A man who had insisted he barely knew her. And for 20 years, no one realized the truth might have been sitting in the evidence room the entire time. Outside, the town of Illinois carried on as it always had. Traffic moved along the highway. The diner served coffee to the morning crowd. Snow still drifted across the same lonely road where the body had once been found. But inside the sheriff's office, a case once thought buried in the past had just come violently back to life. And the name on that DNA report was about to reopen a mystery the town had tried very hard to forget. For 20 years, the evidence boxes had sat untouched in a dim storage room beneath the sheriff's office, their labels fading, their contents slowly turning into artifacts of an investigation everyone believed would never move again. Detectives came and went, administrations changed, the town grew older, quieter. But the moment that DNA report arrived in 2023, the past forced its way back into the present with the sudden violence of a door being kicked open. The name on the lab report didn't belong to a stranger. It belonged to someone who had been standing inside the investigation from the very beginning. Someone who had sat across from detectives in a small interview room back in 2003, speaking calmly, answering questions, then walking out of the building without handcuffs. His name was Daniel Mercer. At the time of Emily Carter's death, Mercer had been 27 years old, living alone in a rented house just outside town. He worked nights as a mechanic at a trucking depot along the interstate, a quiet man by most accounts, the type neighbors described with vague, neutral words, kept to himself, polite enough, never caused trouble. Back in 2003, Mercer's connection to Emily had seemed minor. A waitress remembered him stopping by the diner occasionally after his shift. A few casual conversations. Nothing serious. Nothing that suggested the kind of relationship investigators normally focused on. But he had still been questioned. In fact, Mercer had been one of the first people detectives spoke to during the original investigation. The interview transcript still existed, preserved in the old case files now spread across a long conference table in the sheriff's office. Yellowed pages, stapled corners curling with age. Detective Laura Bennett read through the transcript slowly, the quiet hum of fluorescent lights filling the room. Daniel Mercer had told investigators he barely knew Emily Carter. Said he had only spoken to her a few times while grabbing coffee late at night. He claimed that on the evening she died, he had finished work around midnight and driven straight home. No one had been there to confirm it. But in 2003, that detail hadn't seemed enough to push the investigation further. There had been no physical evidence tying Mercer to the crime. No witnesses placing him near Emily that night. No motive anyone could identify. Now, 2 decades later, the situation looked very different. Because Mercer's DNA had just been found inside Emily Carter's car. And not in some distant corner or stray fiber easily explained away. The genetic material had come from the faint smear on the passenger side door panel, the exact spot investigators believed someone might have braced themselves while leaning into the vehicle. It was the first real piece of physical evidence the case had ever produced. But the discovery raised an even more unsettling question. Why had Mercer's DNA been there at all? Detectives reopened every piece of the timeline, reconstructing the final hours of Emily's life with the obsessive precision of people who knew they might finally be close to an answer. The diner records still existed in archived payroll files. Emily had clocked out at 12:36 a.m. that night in January 2003. 2 minutes later, the grainy parking lot camera captured her walking to her car. But there was something investigators noticed this time that no one had focused on 20 years earlier. Just seconds before Emily appeared in the frame, another vehicle passed through the edge of the camera's view. Only the headlights and part of the hood were visible before it disappeared beyond the parking lot entrance. Back in 2003, the footage had been too blurry to matter. Now, forensic video analysts in Chicago enhanced the old recording frame by frame. The results were limited. The resolution was poor, the lighting terrible. But one detail became visible enough to raise new questions. The vehicle looked like a dark pickup truck. And Daniel Mercer had owned a dark pickup truck in 2003. Detectives found the registration record buried deep inside county archives. The vehicle itself had been sold years ago, long since vanished into the endless cycle of used car lots and scrapyards. But the coincidence was impossible to ignore. Mercer had been near the diner that night. Possibly minutes before Emily left work. Detective Bennett leaned back in her chair as the implications settled over the room. Either he was incredibly unlucky, she said quietly, or he's been lying for 20 years. Reopening a cold case is like disturbing a grave. Old memories resurface. People who believed the past was buried are suddenly forced to relive it again. Detectives began tracking down the individuals who had been part of the original investigation, former witnesses, co-workers, anyone who had known Emily Carter in 2003. Many had moved away. Some had died. But a few were still there. One of them was Sarah Donnelly, the waitress who had spoken to Emily just before she left the diner that night. She was older now, lines across her face that hadn't existed in 2003. When detectives knocked on her door, she seemed startled to hear Emily's name again after so many years. For a moment she simply stood there, silent. Then she stepped aside and let them in. The memory came back slowly at first. Sarah described the final minutes of Emily's shift almost exactly the way she had 20 years earlier. Closing duties. Counting tips. A brief conversation near the door. But this time, something different surfaced. A detail so small it had barely registered in 2003. Sarah remembered Emily glancing out the diner window just before leaving. Not in a casual way. In a nervous way. Like she had recognized a car outside. Detective Bennett asked the obvious question. Did she say anything about it? Sarah shook her head. No, she said quietly. But she looked uneasy. That single word changed the tone of the entire investigation. Uneasy meant Emily had noticed something before walking outside. Maybe someone waiting. Maybe someone she hadn't expected to see. Detectives pulled Mercer's old interview again, this time reading every line with the weight of the new DNA evidence pressing down on each sentence. One passage stood out immediately. Back in 2003, Mercer had insisted he hadn't been near the diner that night. He claimed he had gone straight home from work. But the enhanced footage suggested otherwise. If the truck in the video really had been his, then Mercer had lied during the original investigation. And people who lie in murder investigations usually have a reason. The sheriff authorized a full re-examination of Mercer's background. What detectives discovered next deepened the mystery even further. In the years after Emily Carter's death, Mercer had moved multiple times across Illinois. He had changed jobs frequently. Mechanics shops, trucking depots, small garages scattered across different counties. Nothing illegal. Nothing that would have triggered police attention. But the pattern looked restless. Unsettled. Like someone constantly trying to stay ahead of something they couldn't quite outrun. By the time investigators finally located him in 2023, Daniel Mercer was living nearly 90 miles away in a small town near the Indiana border. He was 47 years old. Still working as a mechanic. Still living alone. And completely unaware that a 20-year-old case had just placed his name back at the center of a murder investigation. Detectives watched his house for 2 days before approaching. A modest single-story home with peeling paint and a sagging porch. His pickup truck, different from the one he owned in 2003, sat parked in the driveway. Neighbors described him almost the same way people had 2 decades earlier. Quiet. Kept to himself. Worked long hours. The kind of man no one thought much about. On the third afternoon, 2 detectives walked up the narrow front steps and knocked on the door. They could hear movement inside. Footsteps. Then silence. The door opened slowly. Daniel Mercer stood there staring at them, confusion flickering across his face. Detective Bennett introduced herself and asked a simple question. "Do you remember a woman named Emily Carter?" For a moment Mercer didn't answer. His eyes shifted slightly, like someone searching through old memories they hadn't expected to revisit. Then he nodded once. "Yeah," he said carefully. "I remember." It had been 20 years since anyone had asked him about her. And the next few minutes were about to determine whether that long-buried mystery was finally beginning to unravel or whether the truth behind Emily Carter's death was still hiding somewhere just beyond reach, waiting to slip away again into the silence where cold cases live. For several seconds after the question left Detective Bennett's mouth, the air on Daniel Mercer's porch felt strangely heavy. The late afternoon wind moved softly through the bare trees lining the quiet street, carrying the faint smell of motor oil from the open garage beside the house. Mercer stood in the doorway, one hand still resting on the frame, his eyes fixed on the 2 detectives as though he were trying to decide how much of the past had truly followed them there. "Yeah," he repeated quietly. "I remember her." His voice was calm. Not surprised. Not defensive. Just careful. Detective Bennett had spent nearly 15 years working homicide cases, and she had learned something important about moments like this. People often reveal more in the first 10 seconds of silence than they do in the next 2 hours of conversation. Mercer didn't ask why they were there. He didn't ask what had happened. He simply stepped back and opened the door wider. "You better come in," he said. The living room looked exactly the way detectives expected it might. Sparse furniture. A worn couch facing a television mounted slightly crooked on the wall. A coffee table scattered with unopened mail and a few automotive magazines. The faint hum of an old refrigerator echoed from the kitchen. Nothing unusual. Nothing alarming. Just the quiet, ordinary space of a man who lived alone. Mercer sat down slowly in a chair across from them while the detectives remained standing for a moment, studying the room, letting the silence stretch just long enough to remind him that this conversation wasn't casual. Then Bennett sat across from him. "We're reopening Emily Carter's case," she said. Mercer's expression shifted slightly, not shock, not panic, but something closer to unease. The kind of reaction people have when a memory they hoped had faded suddenly returns in sharp detail. I heard about that when it happened, he said carefully. Back then. You spoke with investigators in 2003, Bennett replied. Mercer nodded. Yeah. They asked me a few questions. I told them the same thing I'll tell you. I barely knew her. The sentence landed in the room with quiet weight. Detective Marcus Hale, seated beside Bennett, opened a thin folder and placed a printed photograph on the coffee table between them. It was the image of Emily Carter's silver sedan taken the day investigators found it behind the closed hardware store. Mercer glanced down at it. For the briefest moment, something flickered across his face. Recognition. Bennett leaned forward slightly. You told detectives 20 years ago that you hadn't seen Emily the night she died. That's right. You also said you weren't near the diner that evening. Mercer shifted in his chair. Because I wasn't. Hale slid another photograph onto the table. This one came from the enhanced security footage. Grainy. Dark. The outline of headlights entering the diner parking lot just minutes before Emily had walked to her car. We recently enhanced some of the old video, Hale said calmly. Mercer looked at the photo again. Still no reaction. But his breathing had changed, slightly deeper now, almost imperceptible unless someone was paying very close attention. Looks like a truck, Mercer said. It does. Bennett folded her hands together. Daniel, you owned a dark pickup truck in 2003. Mercer didn't respond immediately. The refrigerator hummed again in the kitchen. A car passed somewhere down the street outside. Finally, Mercer exhaled slowly. Yeah, he said. I did. So help us understand something, Bennett continued. If you weren't near the diner that night, why does this truck look exactly like yours? The question lingered in the air like smoke. Mercer leaned back in his chair and rubbed a hand across his jaw. I don't know, he said. There were a lot of trucks like that back then. It was a reasonable answer. Too reasonable. People telling the truth often search for details, trying to reconstruct events as accurately as possible. People hiding something tend to offer explanations that close doors instead of opening them. Bennett decided to change direction. Did you ever ride in Emily Carter's car? The question came quickly. Mercer's eyes moved toward her again. No. You're sure about that? Yeah. Hale opened the folder again. This time he removed a document instead of a photograph. A forensic report. He placed it gently on the table, turning it so Mercer could read the first line. The room felt suddenly smaller. Because the first sentence on that report contained a fact that had been waiting 20 years to be spoken aloud. We recovered DNA from inside Emily Carter's vehicle, Hale said quietly. Mercer's gaze moved down the page. Specifically from the passenger side door panel. Still silence. And that DNA, Hale continued, matches you. For the first time since the conversation began, Mercer didn't immediately respond. His eyes remained fixed on the paper. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. Bennett watched the small details closely, the tightening of his jaw, the slight tension building in his shoulders. Finally Mercer looked up. That doesn't make sense, he said. Then explain it to us. Mercer shook his head slowly, as if trying to process information that refused to fit into his understanding of the past. I never rode in her car, he repeated. I told you that. But your DNA was inside it. I can't explain that. His voice had lost some of its earlier steadiness. Outside, the wind rattled lightly against the window glass. Bennett let the silence stretch again, giving Mercer space to keep talking if he wanted. But he didn't. So she pushed a little further. Do you remember talking to Emily at the diner? Sometimes. How often? Mercer shrugged. Every now and then. When I stopped in for coffee. Did you ever meet her outside of work? No. Did you ever drive her anywhere? No. The answers came faster now. Shorter. More controlled. Bennett leaned forward again. Daniel, the evidence says you were inside her car. Mercer's eyes hardened slightly. Then the evidence is wrong. Another long pause followed. And in that pause, something shifted inside the investigation. Because detectives have learned something about interviews over the years, when a suspect denies a fact that can be proven, the conversation becomes less about discovering the truth and more about watching how long the denial lasts. Hale closed the folder quietly. "We're going to need you to come down to the station," he said. Mercer blinked. "Am I under arrest?" "No," Bennett said. "Not right now." The words hung in the air. But everyone in the room understood the implication. Not right now didn't mean never. It meant the investigation was moving again. Mercer stared at the two detectives for several seconds. Then he nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. The drive back to the sheriff's department took just under an hour. Mercer followed the detectives in his truck along a narrow highway that cut through miles of frozen farmland. The sky had already begun darkening by the time they reached town, the same quiet streets that had once known Emily Carter as the smiling waitress who served coffee late into the night. Inside the station, Mercer was led into a small interview room with grey walls and a single metal table. The kind of room designed to remove every distraction except the questions being asked. A recording camera clicked on in the corner. Mercer sat down. Bennett and Hale took their seats across from him. Outside the door, other detectives moved through the hallway, voices low, files in their hands. Because while Mercer sat inside that room repeating the same calm denials he had given 20 years earlier, something else was happening quietly behind the scenes. Investigators had already begun pulling deeper records connected to his life in 2003. Old employment logs. Gas receipts. Traffic cameras from nearby highways that had never been analyzed with modern technology. And somewhere inside those forgotten fragments of the past, detectives believed the real story of Emily Carter's final night might still be hiding. Waiting to surface after 2 decades of silence. Because cold cases rarely reopen without a reason. And when they do, the truth often begins appearing in small, unsettling pieces, each one revealing that the version of events everyone accepted for years may have been built on something far less stable than anyone ever realized. Inside the interview room, Mercer leaned back in his chair as Bennett switched on the recorder. "Let's start again," she said calmly. "Tell us everything you remember about the last time you saw Emily Carter." For the first time that evening, Mercer hesitated. Just long enough for the silence to become noticeable. And in investigations like this, hesitation can be as loud as a confession. The red recording light in the corner of the interview room blinked steadily, a tiny pulse of brightness against the dull grey wall. Daniel Mercer sat motionless in his chair, fingers loosely folded on the metal table, his gaze fixed somewhere between the detectives and the surface of the desk. "Let's start again," Detective Bennett said calmly. "Tell us everything you remember about the last time you saw Emily Carter." The question lingered in the air. Mercer inhaled slowly through his nose, then leaned back in the chair as though trying to search through a memory that had not been opened in years. "I told you already," he said quietly. "I didn't see her that night." Detective Hale didn't respond right away. He simply watched Mercer's face, studying the tiny movements people rarely realize they make when they're under pressure. "You stopped at the diner sometimes," Hale said. "Yeah. Late shifts." Mercer nodded. "Coffee. Maybe a burger if the kitchen was still open. And Emily was working most of those nights." Another nod. "That's right." Bennett folded her hands. "So you talked?" "Sometimes." "What about?" Mercer shrugged slightly. "Nothing big. Just regular stuff. Weather. Work. Small-town conversations." Bennett tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Did you like her?" Mercer hesitated for a moment before answering. "She was nice." "That wasn't the question." Mercer's jaw tightened faintly. "I didn't know her like that." Hale slid another photograph onto the table. This one showed Emily Carter standing behind the diner counter, smiling at the camera sometime months before her death. Her hair tied loosely back, a coffee pot in one hand. Mercer looked at the picture for a long moment. "Did she ever give you a ride somewhere?" Hale asked. "No." "Did you ever sit inside her car while she was parked outside the diner?" "No." "Did you ever lean inside the passenger door to talk to her?" "No." Each answer came immediately now. Too quickly. Bennett leaned forward slightly. Because your DNA was on the inside of that door panel, Daniel. Mercer exhaled slowly. I don't know how that happened. You've said that already. And it's still the truth. Silence returned to the room. Outside in the hallway, a printer whirred somewhere in the office area, the faint mechanical sound echoing through the walls. Bennett let the quiet stretch again. Then she spoke carefully. There's something else you should know. Mercer's eyes lifted. Since we reopened the case, we've been rechecking everything from 2003. Every timeline. Every movement. She slid another sheet across the table. A printed document. Mercer glanced down at it. It was an employment log from the trucking depot where he had worked 20 years earlier. You told investigators you finished work around midnight that night, Bennett said. That's what I remember. But according to your employer's old time records, your shift actually ended at 11:12 p.m. Mercer blinked once. The difference seemed small. But in an investigation, small gaps often matter more than large ones. That was 20 years ago, Mercer said. Maybe I remembered wrong. Maybe, Bennett said. Hale leaned forward slightly. The diner closes at 1 a.m. Emily clocked out at 12:36. Mercer said nothing. That leaves more than an hour between when you finished work and when she left the diner. Still nothing. Enough time, Hale continued calmly, for you to drive there. Mercer's eyes hardened again. You're building a story that didn't happen. Bennett didn't respond to the accusation. Instead she opened another file. Inside were several freshly printed reports gathered during the last 48 hours. Do you remember a woman named Sarah Donnelly? She asked. Mercer frowned slightly. No. She worked at the diner with Emily. Mercer shook his head. I didn't know the other staff. Bennett flipped the page. She remembers you. Mercer looked up again. According to her statement, you were in the diner the night Emily died. For the first time since the interview began, Mercer's composure cracked slightly. That's not true, he said immediately. She says she saw your truck outside. She's wrong. She also remembers Emily looking out the window and noticing the truck. Mercer shook his head harder now. I wasn't there. The denial came fast. Sharp. Almost reflexive. Hale leaned back in his chair. You know what's interesting about memory, he said quietly. Mercer didn't respond. People forget things over time. That's normal. He tapped the DNA report lightly. But evidence doesn't forget. Mercer's gaze dropped again toward the table. The red recording light continued blinking above them. Outside the room, Detective Bennett knew the rest of the team was still working, digging through Mercer's past with the quiet persistence that cold case investigations often required. Already, another development had surfaced. One that Mercer didn't know about yet. 20 years earlier, investigators had pulled traffic records from a state highway toll booth roughly 15 miles from the diner. Back then, the footage had been too grainy to identify vehicles. But modern enhancement software had done something remarkable. Earlier that afternoon, analysts had recovered a partial license plate from one of the vehicles that passed through the toll lane shortly after 1 a.m. on the night Emily died. The plate didn't show every number. But it showed enough. Enough to match the registration record of Daniel Mercer's truck in 2003. The timeline was beginning to tighten around him. Inside the interview room, Mercer shifted again in his chair. Look, he said, his voice lower now. I talked to police back then. If I had anything to do with what happened to her, they would have figured it out. Bennett met his eyes. They didn't have the technology we have now. Another pause. Mercer stared at the table. You're digging up old memories, he muttered. We're following evidence. You're twisting things. Hale leaned forward slightly. Daniel, Emily Carter left work that night expecting to meet someone. Mercer looked up. We know that from her co-workers. I wasn't meeting her. Then why was your truck outside the diner? Mercer didn't answer. Why was your DNA inside her car? Still silence. Why does the timeline place you within minutes of her disappearance? Mercer's jaw tightened again. You're making assumptions. Bennett sat back slowly. No, she said. We're asking questions. Another long stretch of quiet settled over the room. Mercer stared at the wall now, as if searching for something there. Finally he spoke again. I didn't hurt her. The sentence was calm. Measured. But it wasn't the denial Bennett had been waiting for. Because Mercer hadn't said he wasn't with Emily that night. He hadn't repeated that he never saw her. He had only denied hurting her. Detectives notice details like that. They write them down. They remember them later. Bennett leaned forward again, voice steady. Daniel, did you get into Emily Carter's car that night? Mercer hesitated. Not long. But long enough. The hesitation hung there in the air between them, heavy and unmistakable. Then Mercer shook his head. No. But the pause had already done its damage. Because in interrogation rooms, truth often reveals itself not through what people say, but through the small moments before they say it. And outside that room, detectives were still uncovering new pieces of the past, pieces that were slowly forming a picture no one had been able to see clearly in 2003. A picture that suggested Emily Carter had not simply vanished into the darkness that winter night. She had left the diner and driven somewhere with someone she knew. Someone she trusted enough to let into her car. Someone who, for 20 years, had insisted he barely knew her at all. Inside the interview room, the clock on the wall ticked quietly forward. And Daniel Mercer sat beneath the blinking red light, unaware that the story he had been repeating for 2 decades was beginning to collapse around him piece by piece. The clock on the wall ticked with slow, mechanical precision, each second landing like a soft tap against the quiet tension filling the interview room. Daniel Mercer sat back in the metal chair, arms now folded loosely across his chest, his eyes drifting toward the corner of the table where the DNA report still rested like a silent accusation. Detective Bennett watched him carefully. Interrogations rarely explode into dramatic confessions. Most of the time they unfold slowly, the truth leaking through cracks in a story that once seemed solid. And Mercer's story, repeated the same way for 20 years, was beginning to show those cracks. You said you didn't hurt her, Bennett said quietly. Mercer looked up. That's right. But you didn't say you weren't with her. Mercer's jaw tightened again. I told you I didn't see her that night. That's not what I asked. Silence. Hale leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. Daniel, did Emily Carter ever ask you for help? Mercer frowned faintly. What do you mean? Car trouble. Ride somewhere. Anything like that. Mercer shook his head. No. Bennett slid another photograph across the table. This one was newer, taken during the recent re-examination of the evidence. It showed the interior of Emily's car, the passenger side door panel circled in red where the DNA sample had been collected. You see this spot? Bennett said. Mercer nodded slowly. That's where your DNA was found. I heard you. That area is exactly where someone would place their hand if they leaned into the passenger seat. Mercer didn't respond. So here's one possibility, Bennett continued. Emily was sitting in the driver's seat. You were standing outside the car, leaning in through the passenger door. Mercer's eyes narrowed slightly. You're guessing. Maybe, Hale said. But it fits the evidence. Mercer leaned back again. You want a story, he said. You already decided I'm in it. No, Bennett replied calmly. We're trying to figure out why you're in it. Another long pause followed. Then Bennett asked a question that had been waiting quietly inside the investigation for 2 decades. Did you ask Emily to meet you that night? Mercer's eyes flickered briefly. No. Did she ask to meet you? No. Then why was she looking out the diner window at your truck? Mercer shook his head. I wasn't there. But the denial sounded weaker now. Because outside the room, investigators had uncovered something new only minutes earlier. Another forgotten piece of the past. Back in 2003, detectives had spoken with dozens of customers who had been inside the diner during Emily's final shift. Most interviews produced nothing useful. But one of those witnesses had recently been located again. His name was Mark Delaney, a truck driver who had stopped for coffee that same night before continuing down the interstate. When detectives contacted him earlier that afternoon, Delaney had struggled at first to remember details from so long ago. But then something clicked. A small memory resurfaced. He remembered a man standing near the diner's entrance just before midnight. Not inside. Outside near the payphone mounted on the wall. Delaney hadn't known the man's name. But when detectives showed him a recent photograph of Daniel Mercer, Delaney's reaction had been immediate. "That's him," he said. The memory came back clearly after that. The man by the payphone had looked agitated, pacing slightly, glancing toward the diner window more than once. Almost like he was waiting for someone. Inside the interview room, Mercer shifted in his chair again. Bennett watched the movement carefully. "Daniel," she said softly, "a witness remembers seeing you outside the diner that night." Mercer looked up sharply. "That's impossible. He remembers you standing by the payphone." Mercer shook his head again, faster now. "No. He says you were watching the window." Mercer leaned forward suddenly. "He's wrong. Why would he lie?" "I don't know. But he picked you out of a photo without hesitation." Mercer rubbed his forehead with one hand. "This is crazy," he muttered. Hale studied him quietly. "You know what's interesting about cold cases," he said. Mercer didn't respond. "People think time makes evidence weaker. But sometimes the opposite happens." Mercer looked at him again. "Memories fade," Hale continued. "But technology improves. And old evidence gets looked at with fresh eyes." Mercer said nothing. 20 years ago," Hale added, "you were just one of many people investigators talked to." The room fell silent again. "But now," Bennett said quietly, "you're the only one whose DNA is inside her car." Mercer stared down at the table. His breathing had grown slower, heavier. And for the first time since the interrogation began, he asked a question of his own. "What happens if I leave?" Bennett didn't hesitate. "You're free to go." Mercer looked surprised. "Right now you're not under arrest," she continued. "But that could change." The implication hung there heavily. Mercer leaned back again, eyes fixed on the wall behind the detectives. 20 years, he said quietly. "What about it?" Hale asked. "That's a long time." "Yes," Bennett said. Mercer nodded slowly. "People forget things in 20 years. "Sometimes," Bennett replied. Mercer looked at the DNA report again. "But sometimes they don't," he murmured. Outside the interview room, another detective entered the hallway carrying a fresh folder of documents. Inside were several newly recovered records investigators had managed to locate earlier that evening. One of them was a phone log from the old payphone outside the diner. The machine itself had been removed years ago, but archived billing records still existed in the telecommunications company's database. At 12:21 a.m. on the night Emily Carter died, that payphone had placed a call. A short call. Just 42 seconds long. The number dialed had been traced earlier that night. It belonged to a prepaid cell phone that had been registered under a fake name in 2003. But investigators had just discovered something remarkable. That phone had only been used 3 times in its entire lifespan. Once on the night it was activated. Once on the night Emily Carter died. And once again 2 days later. The final call from that phone had gone to a local auto parts supplier. A place where Daniel Mercer had been working part-time at the time. The connection wasn't absolute. But it was enough to tighten the web around him even further. Inside the interview room, Mercer slowly stood up from his chair. "I think I'm done talking," he said. Bennett didn't move. "That's your choice." Mercer glanced at the door. Then back at the table. Then finally at the detectives. "You don't know what happened that night," he said quietly. "No," Bennett replied. "But we're getting closer." Mercer stared at her for a moment longer. Then he turned and walked toward the door. In the hallway outside, detectives stepped aside as he passed, their expressions unreadable. No one stopped him. No one spoke. Mercer walked out of the sheriff's office and into the cold night air, the same kind of winter darkness that had hung over the town 20 years earlier. But as he drove away, one thing had changed. The investigation that once ended in silence was now moving again. And somewhere inside the growing pile of evidence, old memories, new technology, forgotten records, the truth about Emily Carter's final night was slowly beginning to surface. The kind of truth that doesn't stay buried forever. Especially in a case that had waited 2 decades for someone to finally start asking the right questions again. The cold night air outside the sheriff's office felt sharper than usual as Daniel Mercer stepped into the parking lot. The building lights cast long yellow beams across the frozen pavement, and for a moment he simply stood beside his truck without moving, staring at the empty street beyond the lot. 20 years. 2 decades had passed since the night Emily Carter died, and until that afternoon Mercer had believed the past was finished with him. The investigation had faded. Detectives had moved on. The town had buried the story under newer headlines and quieter routines. But now the past had returned. And it had arrived carrying something far more dangerous than suspicion. It had arrived carrying evidence. Mercer climbed into his truck and closed the door slowly. The engine turned over with a rough mechanical growl, headlights cutting through the darkness as he pulled out of the lot and drove into the quiet streets of the town he hadn't visited in years. Inside the sheriff's office, the investigation continued moving forward. Detective Bennett stood in the hallway outside the interview room, reviewing the fresh documents that had arrived minutes earlier. The phone records from the diner's old payphone lay spread across a table, along with a map of the surrounding area. Detective Hale leaned against the wall, studying the numbers. 42 seconds, he said quietly. That's all the call lasted. Bennett nodded. Long enough to confirm a meeting place. Hale looked toward the empty interview room where Mercer had been sitting less than 10 minutes earlier. If he used that phone to contact Emily, Hale said, he wouldn't have used his own cell. Exactly. In 2003, prepaid cell phones had been easy to obtain and nearly impossible to trace. Disposable numbers, fake registrations, cash purchases. Perfect tools for someone who didn't want to leave a trail. But technology had changed. Modern investigators could examine patterns that detectives 2 decades earlier simply didn't have the tools to analyze. And one of those patterns had just revealed something unsettling. The prepaid phone connected to the payphone call had briefly pinged a nearby cell tower that night. The same tower that covered the stretch of road where Emily's car had later been discovered. Hale tapped the map with his finger. From the diner to here, he said. 8 miles. Bennett crossed her arms, studying the distance. If Mercer called her from the payphone, she said slowly, he could have told her to meet him somewhere nearby. Hale nodded. Maybe she drove out to talk. Maybe she trusted him. The possibility hung heavily between them. Because Emily Carter had shown no signs of a struggle before the fatal injury that ended her life. The medical examiner's report had always suggested the same disturbing conclusion. She had been caught off guard. Attacked suddenly by someone standing close enough to strike without warning. Someone she didn't fear. Inside the evidence room down the hall, another detective had reopened the box containing items recovered from Emily's car. The smell of old paper and plastic filled the air as technicians carefully laid each object onto a long metal table. Her purse. A receipt from the diner. A small notepad. And one item investigators had overlooked for years. A folded piece of paper tucked inside the side compartment of the passenger door. The paper was fragile now, yellowed slightly with age. When the technician unfolded it, the room fell quiet. Because written across the page in blue ink was a short message. 3 words. County Road 14. The same road where Emily Carter's body had been discovered hours later. Detective Bennett was called into the evidence room immediately. She stared at the note in silence for several seconds. "This was in the car the whole time?" she asked. The technician nodded. It was tucked inside the door compartment. Must have slipped behind the panel during the original search. Hale looked down at the handwriting. "Looks like her writing." Bennett nodded slowly. Probably directions. Or a meeting spot. The realization settled across the room like a slow wave. Emily hadn't ended up on County Road 14 by accident. She had gone there deliberately. Because someone had told her to meet them there. Hale exhaled quietly. And Mercer was the last person known to be waiting outside the diner. Bennett looked back at the note again. The letters were slightly rushed, like someone had scribbled them quickly before leaving. A simple reminder. A location. A destination. But now it carried a far darker implication. Emily Carter had driven out to that lonely road expecting a conversation. Instead, it had become the last place she would ever see alive. Across town, Daniel Mercer drove slowly through the darkened streets, the glow of streetlights flashing across the windshield as he passed beneath them. His grip on the steering wheel had tightened slightly. The detective's questions echoed in his mind. The DNA. The witness. The payphone. Too many things were surfacing. Too many things he had once believed were gone forever. When Mercer reached the edge of town, he turned onto the highway without hesitation. The road stretched forward through miles of empty farmland, the same landscape that had surrounded the town 20 years earlier. The same quiet darkness. The same endless fields. But inside the sheriff's office, investigators were now seeing that night with a clarity they had never had before. Emily Carter leaves work at 12:36 a.m. She receives a call minutes earlier from the payphone outside the diner. A man, very likely Daniel Mercer, waits outside watching the building. Emily writes down a location. County Road 14. She drives out there alone. And somewhere along that isolated road, something goes terribly wrong. The question that had haunted the case for 20 years still remained. What happened in those final moments? Back in the evidence room, Hale stared down at the note again. Do we know if Mercer ever lived near County Road 14? He asked. Bennett thought for a moment. Not there, she said. But his old job at the trucking depot sat just a few miles south of that road. Hale nodded slowly. So he knew the area. Very well. Another detective entered the room carrying a laptop. You're going to want to see this, he said. On the screen was a satellite image of County Road 14 from early 2003, recovered from archived mapping data. The area looked almost identical to today. A narrow stretch of pavement cutting through farmland. One abandoned barn sitting several hundred yards off the road. Hale leaned closer to the screen. Was that barn there back then? He asked. The detective nodded. Property records say it was empty even in 2003. Bennett studied the image carefully. An abandoned structure in the middle of nowhere. No nearby houses. No witnesses. The kind of place someone might choose if they didn't want to be seen. Her voice dropped slightly. Emily didn't just meet someone on that road. Hale looked at her. She was led there. The room fell quiet again. Because the more the timeline took shape, the clearer one fact became. The meeting on County Road 14 hadn't been spontaneous. It had been planned. Carefully. Deliberately. And the man detectives had just questioned, who insisted he barely knew Emily Carter, was now connected to nearly every step that led her there. But the most important question still lingered in the shadows of the investigation. What exactly happened on that dark road after she arrived? Because whatever took place out there had remained hidden for 20 years. And somewhere in Daniel Mercer's memory, the answer to that question was still waiting. Silent. Buried. But no longer safe from the truth slowly rising around it. The note lay flat beneath the bright evidence room lights, its edges slightly curled with age, the blue ink faded but still unmistakable. County Road 14. 3 simple words. For 20 years the investigation had circled that lonely stretch of asphalt like a puzzle missing its centerpiece. Detectives knew Emily Carter had died there. They knew someone had left her body in the roadside ditch. But until now, no one had understood the most chilling detail of all. Emily hadn't been taken there. She had gone there willingly. Detective Bennett stared at the note a little longer before speaking. She wrote this before she left the diner. Detective Hale nodded slowly. Which means someone told her to meet them there. Exactly. The room fell quiet again. Because the timeline was finally beginning to make sense. At 12:21 a.m., the payphone outside the diner places a short call. Minutes later, Emily writes down the location. At 12:36 a.m., she clocks out. Then she drives alone into the darkness toward County Road 14. But she never returns. The question now wasn't whether Emily had planned to meet someone. The question was whether she realized who that someone truly was. Across town, Daniel Mercer's truck rolled along the dark highway, the tires humming against the frozen pavement. He hadn't turned on the radio. The silence inside the cab felt safer somehow. But the detective's questions continued echoing in his head. Why was your truck outside the diner? Why was your DNA inside her car? Why were you near County Road 14? Mercer tightened his grip on the wheel. 20 years earlier, the investigation had collapsed under the weight of missing evidence. No witnesses. No cameras. No forensic technology capable of extracting the tiny traces investigators could now recover. Back then, time had protected him. Now time was working against him. Inside the sheriff's office, the investigation was moving faster than it had at any point in the past 2 decades. Detectives gathered in the conference room as Bennett laid the note from Emily's car in the center of the table beside the updated timeline. Let's assume Mercer made the call from the payphone, she said. Hale nodded. He tells Emily to meet him on County Road 14. Why there? Another detective asked. Bennett pointed to the satellite map projected onto the wall. That road sits less than 5 minutes from the old trucking depot where Mercer worked. Another officer leaned forward. So he knew the area. Better than most people. Hale studied the map carefully. Which means he also knew how isolated it was. The realization spread quietly through the room. County Road 14 wasn't just remote. It was perfect. Minimal traffic. Miles of farmland. And that abandoned barn sitting just off the roadside. A structure investigators had searched in 2003 but found nothing inside except dust and rotting wood. Back then they believed Emily had been killed somewhere else and her body dumped near the ditch. But what if that assumption had been wrong? What if the fatal confrontation happened right there? Bennett looked around the table. Tomorrow morning we're going back out there. Hale nodded immediately. With the new forensic tools. Another detective added quietly, ground-penetrating radar too. 20 years earlier, investigators had only been able to search the surface. Now they could look beneath it. Outside the station windows, the town had grown silent under the deep winter night. But the case that had once seemed frozen in time was moving again. And somewhere out in those dark fields, the ground might still be holding secrets no one had been able to see before. The next morning arrived cold and grey. A thin layer of frost covered the empty farmland surrounding County Road 14 as the sheriff's convoy pulled onto the narrow shoulder just after sunrise. The road looked almost identical to the photographs from 2003. Long. Quiet. Unforgivingly empty. Detective Bennett stepped out of the vehicle and pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders as the wind moved across the fields. For a moment she simply stood there, looking down the stretch of pavement where Emily Carter's body had once been found. The ditch where deputies discovered her was still there, the grass thinner now, flattened by years of winter storms. Hale joined her near the roadside. Hard to believe nothing here has changed, he said. Bennett glanced toward the barn sitting in the distance. Except what we're able to see. Forensic technicians began unloading equipment from the vehicles. Metal cases opened. Tripods unfolded. Ground-penetrating radar units hummed to life as they were assembled near the roadside. 20 years earlier the search had lasted only a few hours. Today it would last all day. The team began slowly sweeping the field beside the road first, the radar unit gliding back and forth across the frozen soil. A monitor displayed shifting lines and shapes as the signal penetrated the ground below. Most of it showed nothing unusual. Just layers of dirt and rock. But 40 minutes into the scan, the technician operating the radar suddenly stopped. Hold on, he said quietly. Bennett turned immediately. What do you see? The technician adjusted the screen brightness and pointed to a faint rectangular disturbance roughly 6 feet beneath the surface. The shape was subtle, but unmistakable. Soil disruption, he said. About 8 feet long. Hale stepped closer to the monitor. That's not natural. No, the technician said. It's not. For a moment no one spoke. Because every person standing there understood exactly what the image suggested. Someone had dug there once. And then covered it again. Bennett looked toward the quiet stretch of road where Emily's body had been found 2 decades earlier. The wind moved softly through the dry grass. What's the depth? She asked. About 6 feet, the technician replied. Hale exhaled slowly. That's grave depth. The word hung heavily in the cold air. Investigators quickly marked the area with bright orange flags while another team prepared excavation tools. Shovels cut into the frozen soil. Layer by layer, the ground began opening beneath them. For 20 years, whatever lay buried there had remained hidden just a few yards from where deputies had stood that night. But now the earth itself was beginning to give up its secret. After nearly an hour of digging, one of the technicians suddenly stopped. I've got something. Everyone moved closer. A fragment of dark fabric had appeared beneath the soil. Carefully, the team cleared more dirt away. Then something else emerged beside it. Bone. Small. Pale. Human. The field fell silent except for the wind. Detective Bennett stared down into the shallow pit, the reality settling slowly over the scene. Emily Carter had been found near this road in 2003. But she had never been buried here. Which meant the remains now emerging from the ground belonged to someone else. Someone who had disappeared without anyone realizing they were gone. Hale's voice dropped to a whisper. This wasn't just a meeting place. Bennett nodded slowly. No. Her eyes moved across the empty farmland. Across the silent barn. Across the road where Emily had died. This place was already hiding something. And somewhere miles away, Daniel Mercer was driving through the same quiet countryside, unaware that the ground beneath County Road 14 had just uncovered a secret that might change the entire investigation. Because the discovery of a second body meant one terrifying possibility investigators could no longer ignore. Emily Carter might not have been Daniel Mercer's first victim. And if that was true, then the cold case they thought they were solving had just become something far darker. The wind moved slowly across the open farmland as investigators stood around the excavation site beside County Road 14. Frost clung to the edges of the freshly turned soil, and the quiet hum of the radar equipment faded as technicians shut it down. Everyone's attention was fixed on the shallow pit in the ground. The fragment of bone had been only the beginning. Careful hands continued brushing away layers of dirt, each movement deliberate, slow, controlled. In forensic excavation, patience mattered more than speed. Every inch of soil might contain a clue. Another piece of bone appeared. Then another. Within minutes, the outline of a human skeleton began to emerge beneath the dirt. Detective Hale stood near the edge of the pit, arms folded tightly against the cold as he watched the process unfold. This wasn't a recent burial, one of the technicians said quietly. Bennett nodded. The soil surrounding the bones had already told them that much. The body had been underground for many years. Possibly decades. Which meant one thing investigators had not expected when they reopened Emily Carter's case. Someone else had disappeared long before her. And whoever had buried this person had chosen the exact same stretch of land where Emily Carter would later die. The realization felt heavy in the air. Hale glanced toward the abandoned barn in the distance. You think Mercer knew this was here? He asked quietly. Bennett didn't answer right away. Her eyes remained fixed on the excavation site. I think Mercer knew this road very well, she said. The technicians continued their work. Slowly, the remains became clearer. The skeleton appeared small. The structure suggested a young adult. Fragments of clothing still clung to parts of the bones, dark fabric that had nearly dissolved after years underground. One of the forensic specialists carefully uncovered something near the rib cage. A small metal object. He lifted it gently with gloved hands. "Pendant," he said. The chain had broken long ago, but the small charm attached to it remained intact. A silver heart. On the back, faint engraved letters could still be seen beneath the dirt. The technician brushed it lightly. 3 initials appeared. LM. Bennett exchanged a glance with Hale. "Log that immediately," she said. The pendant was placed carefully into an evidence bag. If investigators could identify the person buried here, the entire scope of the investigation might change. Because Emily Carter's case had always been treated as an isolated tragedy. But the discovery beneath the soil suggested something much darker. Someone had chosen this road before. Someone had buried a body here long before Emily ever drove down that lonely stretch of pavement. And if Daniel Mercer had known about it, then the road itself might have been part of a pattern. Back at the sheriff's office later that afternoon, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The cold case unit now looked less like a quiet review of old evidence and more like the center of an unfolding crisis. Files were stacked across every table. Maps covered the walls. And the remains recovered from County Road 14 were already being transported to the State Forensic Lab for immediate examination. Detective Bennett stood in the conference room reviewing missing persons reports from the late 1990s and early 2000s. The pendant's initials LM were now the only clue investigators had about the identity of the second victim. Hale walked in carrying another folder. "You're not going to like this," he said. Bennett looked up. "What did you find?" Hale opened the folder and slid a printed report across the table. It was a missing persons file from 1998. The photograph attached to the report showed a teenage girl with shoulder-length brown hair and a shy smile. Her name was Lena Mitchell. She had disappeared in the summer of 1998. Just 18 years old. Last seen leaving a gas station roughly 12 miles from County Road 14. Bennett studied the photograph carefully. The initials. LM. The timeline. Everything suddenly aligned in a way that made the room feel colder. "She vanished 5 years before Emily," Hale said quietly. "Did they ever find her?" Hale shook his head. "No body. No suspect." Bennett leaned back slowly in her chair. "And where did Lena Mitchell work?" Hale pointed to a line in the report. "A roadside diner just outside town." Bennett's eyes narrowed. "Not the same diner as Emily?" Hale nodded. "The same one." For several seconds neither detective spoke. Because the coincidence was too precise to ignore. 2 young women. 5 years apart. Both working late shifts at the same diner. One buried near County Road 14. The other found dead on the same road. Bennett exhaled slowly. This wasn't random. Hale shook his head. No. The implication was impossible to avoid. Emily Carter might not have been the first woman Mercer targeted. And Lena Mitchell might not have been the only one buried in those fields. Across the state line, Daniel Mercer had spent the afternoon in his small garage, the familiar sounds of tools and machinery filling the quiet building. But his focus had drifted. Twice he had dropped a wrench. Once he had forgotten to tighten a bolt he had already worked on. The conversation at the sheriff's office replayed in his mind like a loop he couldn't turn off. The DNA. The witness. The timeline. He knew investigations. He knew how they worked. One piece of evidence alone might not mean much. But several pieces together. They started forming something harder to escape. Mercer wiped his hands on a rag and walked toward the garage door, staring out at the empty road beyond the lot. For 20 years he had believed the past had been sealed away. But something about the detective's tone that afternoon had unsettled him deeply. They sounded certain. Too certain. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a quiet thought began to surface. What if they had found something else? Something he had never expected anyone to discover. As night fell again over the Illinois countryside, Investigators continued working late inside the sheriff's office. The discovery at County Road 14 had already transformed the case from a single cold murder into something far more disturbing. 2 victims connected to the same road. The same diner. And possibly the same man. Detective Bennett stared at the missing persons file one more time before closing it slowly. Outside the window, snow had begun drifting softly through the darkness. "Find everything we can on Mercer from the late 90s, she said to the team. Hale nodded. Work history, addresses, friends, everything. Because if Lena Mitchell truly lay buried beneath that field for 25 years, then the story of Daniel Mercer was about to become much darker than anyone had imagined. And the quiet road where Emily Carter had died might only be the beginning of a much longer trail of secrets buried beneath the cold Illinois soil. Snow drifted steadily across the dark Illinois countryside as the investigation moved deeper into territory no one had expected when the cold case reopened. Inside the sheriff's office, the lights remained on long past midnight. Detectives sat surrounded by stacks of files, computer screens glowing pale against the dim room as they pieced together fragments of a past that had been buried for decades. The discovery at County Road 14 had changed everything. What began as the reopening of Emily Carter's unsolved death had now uncovered something far more disturbing, the remains of a second victim hidden beneath the frozen ground. And if the evidence pointed where investigators believed it did, the quiet mechanic named Daniel Mercer might have been carrying secrets far older and far darker than anyone had ever suspected. Detective Bennett stood near the large wall map where colored pins marked locations connected to the case. The diner. The payphone. The spot where Emily's body had been discovered. The excavation site where the skeleton had just been unearthed. She placed another red pin carefully onto the map. Lena Mitchell's last known location, she said quietly. Detective Hale stepped beside her, studying the pattern that was slowly emerging. The gas station where Lena had last been seen in 1998 sat only a short drive from the diner where both young women had worked. And just a few miles beyond that. County Road 14. Hale exhaled slowly. That road keeps showing up. Bennett nodded. And Mercer knew it. The investigation team had spent the evening digging through Mercer's background from the late 1990s. Employment records. Old addresses. Vehicle registrations. And one detail had already surfaced that sent a chill through the room. In 1998, the same year Lena Mitchell disappeared, Daniel Mercer had been working night shifts at the trucking depot located less than 3 miles from County Road 14. The same job he still held 5 years later when Emily Carter died. The same job that placed him on the roads late at night, driving through the same isolated farmland long after most people had gone home. The pattern felt impossible to ignore now. Hale flipped through another document. "You want the really uncomfortable part," he said quietly. Bennett looked at him. The diner Lena worked at in 1998. He tapped the page. Was the exact same diner Emily worked at in 2003. For a moment neither detective spoke. Because the implication had now grown impossible to dismiss as coincidence. 2 young women. 5 years apart. Both working late-night shifts at the same roadside diner. Both last seen alive shortly after leaving work. And both connected to the same quiet mechanic who insisted he barely knew either of them. Across the room, another detective called out. "We've got the preliminary forensic estimate from the excavation." Bennett walked over immediately. The technician held up a printed sheet. "Based on bone condition and soil analysis, the remains we recovered have likely been buried between 24 and 27 years. Bennett felt her stomach tighten slightly. That timeline placed the burial almost perfectly around Lena Mitchell's disappearance in 1998. "Cause of death?" Hale asked. The technician shook his head. "Too early to say. The remains are still being processed." But even without a confirmed cause, the evidence was beginning to draw a line between 2 moments separated by years. A line that ran straight through Daniel Mercer. Miles away, Mercer sat alone in his small living room, the television flickering silently in front of him. He wasn't watching it. The images changed across the screen, but his attention stayed somewhere else entirely. Outside, the snow continued falling lightly, covering the empty street in a thin layer of white. The quiet reminded him of another night many years ago. A night when the roads had been just as empty, just as cold. He leaned forward slowly, resting his elbows on his knees. 20 years earlier, everything had gone wrong. A moment that had started as something simple, something he believed he could control, had spiraled into something he could never undo. But the investigation back then had failed. No witnesses. No proof. No reason for anyone to suspect him. The past had remained buried. Until now. Mercer rubbed his hands together slowly. Detectives reopening the case had been troubling enough. But if they had found something on County Road 14? His thoughts stopped there. He hadn't heard any news reports yet. No phone calls. No officers returning to his house. But a quiet instinct told him something had changed. Something had been uncovered. Something that should never have been found. Back at the sheriff's office, the case was accelerating quickly. Another development had just arrived from the forensic lab examining Emily Carter's clothing preserved from the original investigation. A technician entered the conference room carrying a sealed evidence envelope. "New trace analysis," she said. Bennett opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a printed report along with several microscopic photographs. Hale leaned closer. "What are we looking at?" "Fibers," the technician said. "Recovered from Emily's jacket during the reanalysis." The images showed several thin strands of dark material. At first glance they looked ordinary. But the report beneath them told a different story. These fibers matched the interior upholstery used in certain pickup trucks manufactured between 1995 and 2002. Hale frowned slightly. "That's a wide range." "Yes," the technician replied. "But the specific weave pattern narrows it down." She pointed to another section of the report. "The closest match we've found so far comes from a truck model Daniel Mercer owned in 2003. The room fell quiet again. Because once again, Mercer's name had appeared where it shouldn't. Bennett slowly placed the report on the table. "His truck." Hale nodded grimly. If Emily got into that vehicle, then the confrontation could have started there. And ended on County Road 14. The pattern was becoming clearer by the hour. Emily leaves the diner. She meets Mercer. She either enters his truck or allows him into her car. They drive out to the road. And somewhere in the darkness, something turns violent. But now investigators knew something else. The road Mercer chose wasn't random. Because 5 years earlier, he may have already used that same place to bury someone else. Bennett looked around the room at the team working tirelessly through the night. "Get a warrant ready," she said. Hale raised an eyebrow. "For Mercer's house. And his garage." If Mercer had buried one body near County Road 14, there was a real possibility that evidence connected to both victims might still exist somewhere in his life. Tools. Clothing. Old photographs. Anything that might link him directly to the crimes. Hale nodded slowly. "You think he kept something?" Bennett stared at the map of County Road 14 one more time. "People who hide things for that long," she said quietly, "often keep reminders." Outside, the snowstorm thickened across the silent farmland, covering roads, fields, barns, and the lonely stretch of pavement where two lives had intersected with something dark that refused to stay buried forever. Because somewhere inside Daniel Mercer's quiet world, the past was closing in. And by morning, investigators would be knocking on his door again. This time with a warrant. And far more questions than the man who walked out of the sheriff's office the day before had ever expected to face again. Morning arrived under a thick gray sky, the kind that presses low over the Illinois farmland and makes the whole landscape feel quieter than usual. Snow from the night before lay across the fields in a thin white sheet, broken only by tire tracks and the dark lines of narrow rural roads cutting through the countryside. At 6:12 a.m., 3 sheriff's vehicles turned slowly onto the street where Daniel Mercer lived. The neighborhood was silent. Most of the houses still sat in darkness, curtains drawn against the cold, the residents inside unaware that a case buried for 2 decades had just reached the most dangerous moment of its return. Detective Bennett stepped out of the lead vehicle, the search warrant folded neatly inside the folder tucked under her arm. Detective Hale joined her beside the curb. "You think he's inside?" Hale asked quietly. Bennett glanced toward the small house with peeling paint and the narrow driveway where Mercer's pickup truck sat parked. "He was last night," she said. The garage door beside the house was half closed, the bottom edge lifted just enough to reveal the shadow of tools hanging on the wall inside. A place where Mercer had spent most of his adult life working. A place investigators now believed might contain pieces of a past no one had ever uncovered. Bennett nodded toward the front porch. "Let's do it." The team moved quickly. Boots crunched softly in the snow as they approached the door. Hale knocked once. Hard. The sound echoed through the quiet street. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. Bennett glanced at the other deputies. "Daniel Mercer," Hale called out loudly. "Sheriff's Department." For several seconds the house remained completely silent. Then a faint sound moved inside. Footsteps. Slow. Measured. The door opened. Mercer stood there again, his face pale under the dim hallway light behind him. His eyes moved across the group of officers gathered on his porch. This time he didn't look surprised. Just tired. Bennett held up the warrant. "We're conducting a search of your property, Daniel." Mercer stared at the document for a moment before stepping back. "Go ahead," he said quietly. The officers entered quickly, spreading through the house with practiced precision. One team moved toward the garage. Another began photographing the interior rooms. Mercer sat down at the kitchen table while Bennett and Hale remained nearby, watching him carefully. "You didn't bring handcuffs this time," Mercer said after a moment. "Not yet," Hale replied. Mercer gave a faint, almost humorless smile. "You're getting closer though." Bennett didn't respond. Because across the house, investigators were already beginning to uncover things Mercer may not have expected them to find. Inside the garage, deputies moved between workbenches and shelves stacked with tools. The smell of oil and metal filled the space. One officer began opening old storage containers stacked in the corner. Another photographed the interior of Mercer's truck parked inside. Then something unusual appeared on a small shelf near the back wall. A cardboard box. Old. Dust-covered. The officer lifted the lid. Inside were several small objects wrapped in yellowed newspaper. The deputy called out immediately. "Detective Bennett." Bennett stepped into the garage moments later. "What did you find?" The officer carefully unwrapped one of the items. A small silver bracelet slid into view. Thin. Delicate. Clearly not something Daniel Mercer would ever wear. Bennett looked closer. There was engraving along the inside. She leaned forward. The letters were faint but still readable. Lena. The garage suddenly felt colder. Hale stared down at the bracelet. "That's Lena Mitchell's name." Bennett nodded slowly. Which meant the man who claimed he barely knew either victim had been keeping something that belonged to a girl who disappeared 25 years ago. The officer reached into the box again. Another item emerged. A diner name tag. The plastic surface scratched with age. But the printed letters were still visible. Emily. For several seconds no one spoke. Because what they were looking at was no longer coincidence. It was a collection. A set of objects connected to 2 young women whose lives had ended years apart on the same lonely road. Hale turned slowly toward the house. "Bring Mercer in here." Moments later Mercer was led into the garage. His eyes moved around the room before settling on the open box sitting on the workbench. For the first time since the investigation had resumed, his calm expression cracked. Just slightly. But enough. Bennett gestured toward the objects. "You want to explain these?" Mercer stared at the bracelet for several seconds. Then the name tag. Then the detectives. "They were just things," he said quietly. Things you kept. Mercer didn't answer. Hale stepped forward. This bracelet belonged to Lena Mitchell. Silence. And this name tag belonged to Emily Carter. Mercer lowered his eyes. You told us you barely knew either of them, Bennett said. Still no response. The quiet inside the garage felt suffocating now. Outside, snowflakes drifted slowly through the air. Mercer's shoulders sagged slightly as he looked down at the workbench. It wasn't supposed to happen like that, he murmured. The words were barely louder than a whisper. But they stopped every person in the room. Bennett stepped closer. What wasn't supposed to happen? Mercer shook his head slowly. I just wanted to talk to them. About what? He didn't answer right away. His eyes remained fixed on the bracelet. Then he spoke again. It started with Lena. Hale felt the tension in the room spike instantly. Mercer's voice sounded distant now. Like someone replaying an old memory he had tried to bury for years. She was working late at the diner, he said. I'd stop there sometimes. Bennett said nothing. Same as Emily later, Mercer continued quietly. You asked Lena to meet you, Hale said. Mercer nodded faintly. Out on County Road 14. And then? Mercer closed his eyes for a moment. It got out of control. The sentence fell into the room like a stone. For 25 years, Lena Mitchell's disappearance had remained a mystery. Now the answer stood in front of them. Hale's voice hardened. You killed her. Mercer didn't argue. He simply looked down again. And Emily? Bennett asked. Mercer's face tightened. That was different. How? I didn't mean to. Bennett felt a cold anger rising in her chest. You told her to meet you. Mercer nodded. I thought she liked me. And when she didn't? Mercer's silence said everything. Hale stepped forward immediately. Daniel Mercer, you're under arrest for the murders of Lena Mitchell and Emily Carter. Deputies moved in, securing his wrists in handcuffs. Mercer didn't resist. He simply stared once more at the objects sitting on the workbench before lowering his head. For 2 decades, the truth behind Emily Carter's death had remained hidden beneath layers of silence and forgotten evidence. But now the quiet mechanic who believed time had protected him was standing inside a garage filled with pieces of the past he had never expected anyone to see again. And outside, the cold Illinois wind continued drifting across the empty fields surrounding County Road 14. The same road where 2 lives had ended years apart. The same road that had waited patiently for the truth to finally return. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the garage with a sharp metallic snap that seemed louder than it should have been. For a moment, no one spoke. The officers stood still around Daniel Mercer, the cold morning air drifting through the half-open garage door while snowflakes continued falling softly outside. After 20 years of silence, the case that had once baffled investigators had finally broken open. But the weight of that moment didn't feel triumphant. It felt heavy. Mercer stood quietly between the deputies, his head lowered, his shoulders slightly slumped as if the years he had carried this secret were suddenly pressing down on him all at once. Detective Bennett watched him carefully. For 2 decades, Emily Carter's family had lived with unanswered questions. The town had carried the quiet unease that comes with an unsolved murder. And now, standing inside this cluttered garage, the man responsible was finally in custody. But the story still wasn't finished. Because Mercer had said something that continued echoing in Bennett's mind. It started with Lena. Which meant the timeline of violence stretched further back than anyone had imagined. The deputies led Mercer toward the patrol car waiting outside. His boots crunched softly in the snow as he stepped across the driveway. The cold wind cut through the quiet street, rattling bare branches overhead. Neighbors had begun peeking through their windows now. Flashing lights. Police vehicles. A man in handcuffs being escorted down the walk. The quiet mechanic who kept to himself had suddenly become the center of something no one in the neighborhood had ever suspected. Mercer paused briefly beside the patrol car. For the first time since the arrest, he looked up. His eyes moved across the snowy street. The silent houses. the winter sky hanging low above the neighborhood. Then he spoke quietly. I didn't think anyone would ever find her. Detective Hale stood beside him. Lena, he asked. Mercer nodded once. The ground out there is hard, he said faintly. Nobody goes digging in those fields. But someone had. 25 years later, investigators had returned with new technology, new questions, and a determination that had slowly peeled back every layer of the lie Mercer had built. Hale opened the rear door of the patrol car. Mercer stepped inside without resistance. The door closed. The case that once seemed impossible to solve had finally reached its turning point. Back at the sheriff's office later that afternoon, the interrogation room was filled with a different kind of tension than the day before. This time Mercer wasn't sitting there as a cooperative witness. He was sitting there as a man charged with 2 murders. The recorder blinked red again as Detective Bennett placed the files on the table. Across from her, Mercer looked smaller somehow. Not physically, but in the way a person looks once the truth has stripped away the story they've been hiding behind for years. You said it started with Lena Mitchell, Bennett said calmly. Mercer nodded slightly. 1998. Tell us what happened. For several seconds Mercer said nothing. Then he exhaled slowly. I used to stop at the diner after work, he said. Late nights. Bennett waited. Lena was always there, Mercer continued. Same shift most of the time. Did you know her? Not really. But you talked. Sometimes. His voice sounded distant now, as if he were watching the memory unfold rather than reliving it. I asked her to meet me after work one night, he said. On County Road 14. Mercer nodded. She thought we were just talking. Bennett leaned forward slightly. And then? Mercer's eyes dropped to the table. She laughed. The room fell silent. About what? Hale asked quietly. About me. Mercer's jaw tightened slightly. She said she wasn't interested. The next words came slowly. Things got heated. And you killed her, Bennett said. Mercer nodded once. No emotion. No visible regret. Just the quiet acknowledgement of something that had been buried beneath the soil for 25 years. What about Emily Carter? Hale asked. Mercer closed his eyes briefly. That wasn't supposed to happen. You told her to meet you too. Yes. Why? Mercer hesitated. She reminded me of Lena. The answer chilled the room instantly. Same job, Mercer continued quietly. Same smile. Same late-night shift. Bennett felt a quiet anger rising again. You were trying to recreate it. Mercer didn't deny it. But Emily didn't laugh, he said. Then why did she die? Mercer rubbed his hands together slowly. She got scared. Why? I told her about Lena. The words landed like a shockwave. Bennett stared at him. You confessed to a murder while sitting in her car. Mercer nodded faintly. She said she was going to the police. And then? Mercer swallowed. I panicked. The room went silent again. Because that single moment, the second Emily Carter realized who she was sitting with on that lonely road had been the final point where the night could have ended differently. But it didn't. Mercer lowered his head. I hit her. The confession hung in the air. 2 lives lost. 5 years apart. Both beginning with a quiet conversation in the same diner. Both ending on the same empty road. Weeks later, the story spread across the town like a shockwave. Newspapers ran headlines about the arrest. The discovery of Lena Mitchell's remains. The long unsolved murder of Emily Carter finally closing after 2 decades. For many residents, the revelation felt surreal. Daniel Mercer had lived among them quietly for years. Working, shopping, driving the same roads. All while carrying the truth behind 2 missing women whose stories had haunted the community. But in the end, it wasn't luck that solved the case. It was persistence. New forensic science. Old evidence finally re-examined. And the quiet determination of investigators who refused to let a cold case remain frozen forever. County Road 14 still stretches across the farmland the same way it always has. Long. Empty. Silent. But the story attached to that road is no longer buried beneath the soil. Because the truth that waited there for 25 years has finally surfaced. And the echoes of what happened on that dark stretch of pavement now remain etched into the memory of a town that will never look at that road the same way again. The cold case is no longer cold. But the silence of that winter night, the moment two lives crossed paths with a man who believed he would never be discovered, still lingers in the empty fields where the truth slept for decades before finally waking. Even after the arrest, even after the confession, the quiet weight of the case refused to disappear. Because when a secret survives for 20 or 25 years, it leaves marks that don't vanish the moment the truth is spoken. It lingers in places. In memories. In the uneasy realization that a man capable of something terrible once moved through ordinary life without anyone seeing what he carried beneath the surface. Weeks passed, but the investigation did not slow down. Inside the sheriff's office, the evidence room remained active late into the evenings as detectives continued reviewing Daniel Mercer's past. The confession had answered the central mystery of Emily Carter's death. It had also confirmed the fate of Lena Mitchell, whose disappearance had haunted her family for a quarter of a century. But detectives knew something important about cases like this. Confessions tell a story. Evidence tells the truth. And sometimes the two are not exactly the same. Detective Bennett sat at her desk one evening staring at a spread of documents that now covered nearly half the surface of the table. Old employment logs. Address records. Maps showing the places Mercer had lived between 1995 and 2010. One detail continued bothering her. Mercer had confessed to 2 murders. But his movements over the years suggested something more complicated. He had moved often. Not randomly, but frequently enough to stand out when investigators placed the timeline together. 3 towns in Illinois. 1 brief relocation to Indiana. Then back again. Each move happened within months of another missing persons report filed somewhere along the same stretch of interstate. Mercer had spent years driving as a mechanic for trucking depots. Most of those disappearances had never been connected to one another. At least not until now. Detective Hale walked into the office carrying a stack of new case summaries. "You're still here," he said. Bennett glanced up. "So are you." Hale dropped the papers onto the desk. State police pulled every unsolved missing persons report within a 100-mile radius between 1995 and 2010. Bennett scanned the stack. "That's a lot of cases. Most of them unrelated," Hale said. "But a few caught our attention." He flipped to the first page. A photograph stared back from the file. A young woman. Early 20s. Last seen leaving a roadside restaurant along Interstate 74 in 2001. Bennett looked down at the details. "Never found." Hale nodded. "Sound familiar?" Bennett leaned back slowly. The pattern wasn't identical to Lena Mitchell or Emily Carter. But it wasn't completely different either. Late shift. Roadside location. Disappearance near midnight. "What's Mercer say about it?" she asked. Hale shook his head. "We asked him already. And he denies knowing her." Bennett stared at the file for a moment. That answer might have meant something weeks earlier. Now it meant very little. Because Mercer had also denied knowing Lena Mitchell. And he had insisted for years he barely knew Emily Carter. Until the evidence forced the truth out of him. Bennett tapped the photo lightly. "You believe him this time?" Hale didn't answer immediately. Instead he flipped to another report. Another missing woman. Different town. Different year. But another roadside job. Another late shift. Another disappearance that happened during the years Mercer had been working nights on the highways connecting those communities. Bennett exhaled slowly. "We may not be done with him." Hale nodded. "That's what I'm thinking." Across the county jail that same evening, Daniel Mercer sat alone inside a narrow concrete cell. The quiet there was different from the quiet he had known in his house. Different from the quiet garage where he had spent years working with tools and engines and machines that followed simple rules. Jail silence carried something heavier. Regret. Fear. The slow realization that time was now moving in only one direction. Mercer sat on the metal bunk, staring at the floor. He had spoken about Lena. He had admitted what happened to Emily. But investigators had begun asking other questions. Names he claimed not to recognize. Places he insisted he had never visited. Each question pulled at the fragile edge of the story he had finally revealed. And Mercer understood something detectives hadn't yet said out loud. Once a secret begins unraveling, it rarely stops at just one thread. Back at the sheriff's office, Bennett stood beside the large wall map again. The red pins marking Lena Mitchell and Emily Carter remained in place. But new yellow pins had appeared nearby. 3 more missing women. 3 unsolved disappearances. All within driving distance of the highways Mercer had traveled during his years working night shifts. Hale crossed the room slowly. "You think he did it?" he asked quietly. Bennett looked at the map. The pattern wasn't proof. Not yet. But it was enough to keep the investigation alive. "I think we're looking at a man who hid one crime for 25 years, she said. And another for 20. Hale nodded. "And people who get away with something like that sometimes believe they can do it again," Bennett finished. Outside the station windows, winter had begun loosening its grip on the farmland. Snowbanks were shrinking. Fields were slowly reappearing beneath the melting ice. County Road 14 remained as quiet as ever, stretching across the open land exactly the way it had on the nights Lena Mitchell and Emily Carter had driven there. But the road no longer held all its secrets. 2 families now had answers. 2 lives had finally been accounted for. Yet somewhere within the growing stack of unsolved cases scattered across the state, investigators could not ignore a haunting possibility. Daniel Mercer might have told the truth. Or he might have told only part of it. And if that was the case, then the cold case that finally exposed him might not be the end of the story. It might only be the moment when the darkness he carried for decades first began to surface. Because sometimes the most unsettling truth about a long-buried crime isn't the one investigators uncover. It's the one they're still searching for long after the case is supposed to be closed.